All right. Well, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for your patience. At least you know we're not real people and not robots then.
Oh my God.
Otherwise, this would have gone a lot smoother. So, I'm Sean Patrick Hughes. I usually just go by Sean, but there's a lovely Irish comedian who passed not too long ago who eats up all my search content if I don't include my middle name. So I go by Sean. We're here with Katherine Stewart, and Katherine's written a really interesting book about money, lies, and of course I'm going to blank right on the name right in the middle of it. Uh,
Quite all right.
Money, lies, and God, because it's right over Catherine's shoulder there. And I swear I have read the book. It's really good. Um, it's an interesting grouping of research and kind of and a perspective on uh, circa 2015 to now politics in the US. It's a space I spent a decent amount of time on, a lot of focus where I have. But I think a better way to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes would be have Katherine tell you about the book, and then we'll have a quick discussion. And I'm gonna record right now. So um, Katherine, tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, first, thanks so much for bearing with me and my and the sort of technological glitches. It's really great to be here and good to be in conversation with you. So, money lies in God. Look, money is a huge part of the story, meaning that huge concentrations of wealth have destabilized our political system in some pretty interesting ways. America has a lot of very wealthy people, and it's only a sector of the very wealthy who are funding this movement. But they have spent billions of dollars over decades to build the features of the anti-democratic movement, which includes a kind of, I would say, religious nationalist movement or Christian nationalist movement. So they've funneled their money into think tanks, legal advocacy groups, policy groups, networking and leadership development organizations, and so on. They've also funded mechanisms for spreading religious extremism. I think the pastor, the movement leaders is a leadership-driven movement, organization-driven movement. Movement leaders draw conservative or conservative-leaning pastors into networks and give them very sophisticated tools for conveying to them how they should talk about biblical issues when it comes to voting and turning out their congregations to vote. And they give them very sophisticated tools for doing that. So the strength of this anti-democratic movement is in this deeply networked organizational infrastructure. And I really talk about the different strands of that in Money, Lies, and God. So second, lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of the movement. Massive propaganda operations masquerading as media have separated a large section of American voters from the facts, or drawn into sort of conspiratorial mindsets, or distracted them through sort of culture war issues that really don't affect a whole lot of people, but are pretty good at, you know, um, I would say, aggravating identitarian concerns and getting them to vote a certain way. And then number three, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is religious nationalism. Leaders of the movement are exploiting reactionary forms of religion and the culture war issues that they fixate on for politics and power. It's how they mobilize voters to their side. A lot of folks say this isn't, listen, we've got a whole world of Christians who are against Christian nationalism. And in fact, there's a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the Baptist Joint Committee, Vote Common Good. There are just so many groups that are sort of opposed to this agenda. Some of them say this isn't true Christianity. I would say that every religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, like every religion is incredibly diverse. Hinduism, in its different the way that it's practiced and understood. A lot of the way that I do my research is I go to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings and sort of, go to where I can gather the information. And I would have to say that in some of these places, I see people worshiping with as much sincerity and passion as anyone else, as anywhere else. in other places, I see a lot of people using the sort of language or emblems of faith without really seeming to have too much of an engagement with what the Bible actually says. So I sort of want to leave the theological, whether, the theological discussions to the theologians. I really just focus on how religion has been weaponized for politics and power.
And so I think a couple of questions that I have that kind of pop up, and just from a process perspective, the this is a small enough group where we can just throw out what we have. The chat is also, I'll take a look at that if you want to throw it in there. But I'll start off with a few. The uh, first one is, so if I think about how we think about the kind of the balance of inputs into politics, and we say, hey, there's kind of groups that gravitate one way or groups that gravitate the other. And if we think about, historically, not forever and all time, but at least the near recent past, what we say is, there's groups that inherently lean left, groups that inherently lean right. And so if we say, hey, the kind of the more liberal left-leaning folks they get the universities, they get a lot of the media, they get even more recently, which is kind of a newer thing, kind of corporate leadership and corporate America has passed that way. Why should we care a whole bunch whether or not on the conservative side they get the religious input? And so I thought you covered a lot of detail in the book, like why this is not just, hey, business as usual and what's different. So it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're really facing an unprecedented time in our history. I mean, the big news of the past week isn't that Musk and Trump got into a mud fight, really. It's that our system has become so degraded and so corrupt that we take for granted that major matters of national policy are going to be decided not through public deliberation under a system of laws, but by the state of the relationship between two raging and corrupt egomaniacs who happen to have their fingers closest to the government till. I mean, in terms of presidential overreach and corruption, we're really in a situation without precedent. Now, there are plenty of instances of presidential overreach in the past. We could talk about Lincoln arguably claiming new wartime powers. We could talk about Wilson suppressing dissent, FDR and his court packing scheme. Phew, I'm so sorry about that. And so on. But these efforts occurred mostly in exceptional circumstances like war, and mostly could claim some kind of plausible, if at times misguided, appeal to national interest in supporting legal theory. But Trump and his administration, on the other hand, are consciously and willfully denying the legitimacy of the Constitution, the judiciary, or any laws that place limits on their actions. So the lawlessness is frankly unprecedented in American history. Now let's look at the corruption. We've had corruption in the past too. Nixon attempting to subvert the DOJ, et cetera. We've had the Harding administration with its teapot dome scandals and so on. But we've never had a president organize upfront grift along the lines of Trump's meme coin scheme or social media company. No president has accepted $400 million palaces from the sky, palaces in the sky from Qatar, or handed an Elon Musk type oligarch who himself profits from government contracts and gets billions of dollars, billions in taxpayer subsidies. And he gets unaccountable and unconstitutional power over government to sort of go in there with his 19-year-old minions and slash and burn. That's just never happened. The betrayal of America's national security interests is also without precedent. And we've had presidents pursue wrong-headed foreign policies. We've never had, I mean, plenty of those, right? But we haven't had one before who destroys alliances and aligns with adversaries in ways that can be justified only by his self-interest instead of a sort of believing that they were actually doing something in the national interest. Whether or not it worked out well, at least they were trying, right? We've never had a situation where in the face of clear and dangerous breaches of national security protocol, the president responds by praising the individuals who are endangering us. So, um, I mean, just one more example. We've never had a president decide to destroy the scientific research apparatus that has made America very prosperous and also made us the envy of the world. I mean, for no other reason than he thinks now that science is some woke thing that girls do in labs. I mean, it's really disgraceful. So we're learning is that the US constitutional system really only works when it comes with respect for certain norms and institutions. It's not really designed in such a way that it can survive this kind of assault from bad faith actors from within. So, when we talk about religion, it's more than religion. Religion has been weaponized for political purposes. It's a way to get the rank and file to vote for the anti-democratic candidates that the movement favors. I think a final thing I want to say about this is that I would say like authoritarianism isn't it's like a political dynamic that happens to political systems. It's not a program that sets out and it advertises itself as authoritarianism to the rank and file. So when you have a lot of these voters who, they sincerely believe in that abortion is wrong, and so they pull the lever for the anti-abortion candidate and don't look beyond that, they may themselves not be arguing for major changes in the way our government is run, but they're just making a statement about themselves and what they value, right? But they're with their vote, they are lending support right now to uh, uh, candidates that are frankly creating or contributing to an authoritarian movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll pause it. Let me check the chat. Any
Yeah,
questions? Go ahead.
yeah. So, I mean, one thing I heard someone describe the Constitution as just a stack of norms in a trench coat, you know, and the best way to look at that, if you look at the Soviet Constitution and the Chinese Constitution, they have rights in there too, right? They have freedom of speech and all this stuff, but it doesn't matter if the institutions don't enforce them. I guess one way, I grew up in the South, rural South, surrounded by very religious folks in the 70s and 80s. So, I saw this all coming a long time ago. That said, I wonder, like, do you think, and this is really a question for both the right and the left, is there something they get right, whether it's the substance or the political message? And you can, and on the left, you could ask, is there something they get wrong on the substance or the political message that, is mixed up in this?
Yeah, that's this really great question. I could talk about that for hours.
Okay.
Um, One thing that, having spent a lot of time in those spaces, this is a movement where you go in there and there is this great sense of community and common purpose. And people really like that. They like a sense of community. They like a sense of common purpose. They say terrible things about anyone who's not on board with their agenda. I mean, in this sort of religious right MAGA spaces, they'll refer to anybody remotely to the left of them, including what they call rhinos, as um, uh, demonic or satanic. So they literally are demonizing their political enemies. But at the same time, they're also articulating a positive vision of America, you know, and that's very appealing. And I think that, on the left, there have been times when people spend so much time criticizing, the flaws of our country without acknowledging the beautiful ideals that it was built upon. The ideals themselves are worth fighting for. The idea of the ideals of equality and pluralism, the idea that our laws should be deliberated in public on the basis of rational principles, and work to serve the common good, um, deliberated with transparency and should apply to everyone, including our leaders. The idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. These are beautiful ideals, and they really are worth fighting for.
Agree. Uh, I think, and I love the idea of referring to the Constitution as norms. And I think one of the things we've learned over the last, or relearned over the last 10 years or so, is just how much of the executive branch, the limitations of the executive branch have been norms versus hard and fast rules. And through that, you find things like the presidential pardon is um, there's pretty much do whatever you want with it. Um, Executive orders at a minimum can create the need to respond to things legally and end up having the intended consequences of stopping things, stopping funding. Immigration policy, largely just the executive branch, a function to drive sweeping changes in there. And like, to be fair, that was also true in previous administrations to decide to and not decide to enforce other norms. And I do think that like one of the you brought this up, one of the things that it's really, really, really a teachable moment maybe for us is if you build a political platform that is designed on going beyond accountability for the past of your country's shortcomings, right? Every country, every group of people, every society has um, histories, things that they would rather not go back and repeat and that they've learned apart. If you build it focusing on those areas and kind of have a bit of a self loathing to your political platform, you open up the door for the nationalist side a little bit too. So I think that like for me, the I grew up in the late 70s and 80s. I was the son of school teachers who taught in the inner city, and the belief system there was that people were striving to be part of a greater whole, wanted access to that which was available, not to kind of divide, just send a different divide out into the other areas where if you were of a group or from a group, you didn't, you were no longer a voice that was worthy of being heard in any area. And so I think that there's an interesting arc that we've gone on that perhaps like going forward, if there's something positive that comes out of the shift, um, we see that there's really a there's really strength to helping people feel good about themselves as a people, to be part of something that they want to be good and great on. And Catherine, you said aspire and be part of that. It's like that's a huge part of it. And so I would love part of our lesson to be about that going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add another thing that I think that they've done really well is they really mobilize their base. In much of the movement functions as a giant voter turnout machine, and they really get their base out, and they also really make an effort to go after low propensity voters. They're very strategic about it. I remember I was at the last, it was called America Fest. It was at in Phoenix, Arizona. Turning Point USA held it. There were 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters. There's a guy who stood up there and talked about how we went after the Amish. No one had ever gone after them before. We turned them out in Pennsylvania. I'm thinking, yeah, why did nobody go after them before? Like, they're
That's
really,
actually
sorry,
that guy's lying, by the way.
really? Do you know who
Well,
I'm
I mean,
referring to?
Trump got 1,700 more votes from that county in 2024 than in 2020. It's not,
Yeah.
he was claiming hundreds of thousands, and it's not. It's
Well, that's definitely for sure. But one thing that did happen is that, if you look at the proportion, I mean, Trump got about the same number if you look at eligible voters in 2024 as he got in 2020. What happened was there was uh, dampened enthusiasm for voting on the Democratic side of the aisle. We don't have to get into the reasons for that, but proportionally, like statistically, he won by fewer votes, a smaller proportion, I would say, in 2024 than he did in 2020. But they are really good at turning out their base. And one thing that really chilled me is the right invests in organizations and people. And when you invest in this sort of organizational infrastructure that functions as a giant voter turnout machine, if your candidate loses, the investment is still there to some extent because you're funding this like voter turnout operation that actually operates with connections to, but to some degree is outside of the GOP. Whereas, in the last election, there was just a tremendous amount of money spent at the last minute on TV ads. And it's like, wait a second, if you'd taken a portion of that and invested in organizational infrastructure on the sort of pro-democracy side, I don't even want to call it right and left, um, then we might, over time, had that money been invested in that infrastructure, we might be in a different place today. I mean, I've written 3 books about the anti-democratic movement, and each one has been, I want to show you how they did it so that people can sort of potentially think, okay, they built this this network, and this network really works. It's really effective politically. So if people would, there are these pro-democracy organizations, and a lot of them are just struggling for money from from the same sources. The right has a really like very well-funded legal advocacy sphere. It's got, the Alliance Defending Freedom with $102 million per year budget. It's got Pacific Justice Institute. It's got First Liberty. It's got Beckett. It's got the Federalist Society, which grooms and promotes talent for the courts, etc. And on the other side of the political aisle, the sort of the ACLU has a very fractured uh, mission, but they got some money, but they're not just entirely focused on, say, affirming the Establishment Clause, whereas the other side is really committed to degrading or destroying the Establishment Clause. There's Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They do great work, but they don't have half the funding of the Alliance Defending Freedom, anywhere near that. And then what else is there? There's just like a few different, I mean, I think right now the courts, there are different legal organizations, and the courts are doing a pretty decent job of kind of slow rolling some of the damage, pushing back on the unconstitutional orders, etc. So they're able to buy some time, but unless um, pro-democracy folks are able to, win some real political power, we're really, going to be in the same position.
Yeah, I think it's inherently a harder message to sell than the kind of the forceful positive. And I don't mean positive like happy or the connotation of it, but like the actual like it is a positive force driving towards an idea versus defending against it.
Mm.
Or defending against a movement. And I think that like that the question like what is if we want the system to work effectively, there has to be some portion of this is a growing and more positive message. Like, what does that actually look like from the other side of the aisle? And because if you actually break it down, like what I actually want to get to this part. One of the things you described the movement as is reactionary nihilism. And it's interesting to see how does reactionary nihilism or nihilism at all exist within kind of the construct of a theology driven message.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't tend to get into the theology so much, but it strikes me that there are often two sides of the same coin. The same people who are insisting that there is an absolute truth and an all-powerful sort of positive deity are often the same ones who are condemning everything in the world as evil and corrupt. And this is especially true the telltale sign is really when the religious people insist on a punitive God rather than a loving God, an all punitive God. And it strikes me that they're simply um, turning to their theology to express their anger and their destructive impulses and their resentments toward others. I mean, this is a movement that's very good at cultivating resentments and then hurling them at their political enemies. And it's not to say that the resentments are all out of bounds. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be resentful. We've had a sort of winner take all economy now. We've had, don't take my word for it, just look at the sort of sociological data and the economic data. We've had a massive upward concentration of wealth, and people who are benefiting are at the really, tippy top of the economic ladder. It makes life harder for a whole lot of other people. And um and so they often have a sense like, wait, why is my life so much harder than my dad's? He could buy a house on a single salary, and my mom could stay home when the kids were little, and life just seemed a lot easier then. In our family we got two parents and four jobs and we're still struggling. So people are angry, but instead of sort of understanding the real sources of what's making their lives harder, this is a movement that comes along and says, "Oh, it's these immigrants over here, those trans people over there, or whatever." Do you know what I mean? They find scapegoats, or they call, the rhinos are ruining it for you, or the radical left, anyone who, or you know, the public schools are ruining it for you, or the vaccines are ruining it for you. Like they find these scapegoats that they can blame their problems on.
Just something that comes to mind, like they don't do this as much as they used to, but it's partly because Trump is so good at it. Republicans are very good at language, and when so like, let me just reel off some phrases for you: partial birth abortion, government takeover of healthcare,
Hmm.
death panels, death tax. Those words were crafted in focus groups
Yeah.
um, by Frank Luntz, right? They weren't shouted in the streets at a protest. Whereas Democrats, found ourselves having to explain defund the police doesn't really mean defund the police. It means, blah, blah, blah. And, if you're explaining, you're losing. Um, and I wonder, Trump is so good at just like, he just works the crowd, and you hear someone yell, build the wall. And he's like, yeah, that sounds good. Build the wall, and make America great again. That's a perfect slogan, right? It sucks now. Let's make it great. There's no specificity there. I'm wondering, is there a path to where Democrats or the left more broadly can get better at choosing their messaging and not letting it just sort of bubble up from the most extreme factions? Um,
Yeah, one can only hope. I mean, I try to go every year, every couple of years to the March for Life and the National Pro-Life Summit. And every year they have a new theme. One year it's love them both, meaning mom and baby. One year it's pro-life is pro-silence, science, or pro-life is pro-science. One year it's like, you know, equal rights for fetuses or something like that. But the fact is they craft new messages and they craft them to be very sensitive to shifts in cultural trends, right? And um,
well,
and
we even heard "My Body, My Choice" during the vaccine stuff, right? They
Right,
were
right. And
subverting.
and and they message test a lot of stuff. And and I think that it's, you got to be really careful with that stuff. I think it's really they do a great job of that. They have groups that focus it and fund it. They've got, I mean, this is one of the things behind all the sort of religious nationalism and disinformation, and the anti-democratic movement is this giant wave of plutocratic cash. So they're not strapped for funding for message testing and, sitting around. And they also don't really mind lying. They don't feel any, compunction, like partial birth, like the whole thing, I'm one of the many, 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 many women in America who had to have an abortion to save my life. When, between our, we had, I'm very lucky to have wonderful children, but, we were trying to have one, it didn't work out. I've had a few miscarriages, like most women I know. And during one of them, I started to bleed out and, got an abortion to save my life. It was very traumatic, sort of hard to talk about, but at the same time, they'll say you never need an abortion to save abortion is never necessary to save a woman's life. They say it,
Right.
and it's like, well, you're just lying. It's just lying. I mean,
Actually incorrect. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that the other thing that doesn't hurt is that, sitting at the top of the pyramid is, they've one of the greatest ears that we've ever known when it comes to finding something that resonates and just sticks. And I'm from Atlantic City, New Jersey. I grew up hearing it since I was 7 or 8 years old. And we owned most of about half of the casinos where I grew up, and my family worked in the organization. It's a branding and marketing machine. The marriage between that and the willingness to challenge norms and everything that DJ you just brought up. It sits to create, really, it's a juggernaut. And I wrote an essay a few weeks back. Roosevelt will have spent about 3 weeks longer in office than Trump will, from the first day to the last day. And I know he wasn't president for 4 years of that, but he was absolutely a part. If he wasn't the biggest input to the political discourse during that time, he was the second, but I still think he was the first. So if you think about what it actually takes, it's the most successful political arc potentially in American history. And I can tell you, I wouldn't have thought that. It was originally a joke, if we all remember what 2015 was. And it's a remarkable arc to watch. And I think, Katherine, what you're hitting on is some stat, like there's a column in how things matter. And I think it's why the conversation is interesting. What surprised you the most about this book specifically when you were doing research and working for it? Is that, like, if you haven't read the book, Katherine goes deeply into like the amount of time she spends in the groups, in the rallies, in the events, not just reading online and going into it.
Well, the rise of the new right and its coexistence with the religious right was something that I saw on the horizon as I was writing both of my previous books, To Money, Lies, and God. But I sort of wanted to avoid it for a long time because the ideologies in the new right are so unpleasant. The sort of involvement of the alt-right, the sort of ideas taken in some instances from people like Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi political theorist. Um, you know, but surprisingly, I would say the easy coexistence of the rise of the new right with the Christian nationalist movement has been a bit of a surprise. So intellectually, the new right is fundamentally atheistic and committed, at least superficially, to, I'd say, certain ancient pagan sources of supposed wisdom. You would think there'd be some tension with the religious right, but there isn't, because fundamentally both of those movements are organized around their perceived enemies. I call them the power couple of American authoritarianism. So that's been a big surprise.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that.
What did you think I was going to say?
Well, I think that in reading the book, what really comes across, and we've hit on this a bunch in this discussion, is appreciation isn't the right word, but an acknowledgement for the effectiveness of things, which is, like, to me, adds a bunch of credence to what you wrote, because you read one just damning book after chapter after chapter after chapter without actually taking the time to be more introspective about what matters. Like, it's not that I don't care that the morality is what it is or doesn't matter, but what actually is the most important thing is this works. And when I was telling anybody who would listen, 7 or 8 months ago, 9 months ago, that just it's he's gonna get it. It will 45 will be 47. It's coming. They just wouldn't believe it.
Yeah, it's interesting. You saw that too.
I was as certain of that as anything. I was completely wrong in 2015, but yeah. So I would have thought that like that would have been more surprised. But that makes sense because the that is the hardest thing for people who are outside of the movement, even people who aren't just politically averse to it. They're not the political opposite side. They look at it and go, I just don't know how you can square that circle. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't fit. And I think you said it fairly well.
Katie and Alexis, I would love to hear from you if you're willing to unmute yourselves and say something.
Katie, did you want to go first? Do
Oh
you want?
no, go you can go ahead, Alexis.
Okay.
I'm just like absorbing your like how much passion and work and dedication it took into like the work. I know this is not your first book on diving into this topic, but just how deeply you go, like I can really appreciate the craft of that. I'm like new to all this. This is my first salon, so thank you for the amazing experience. Yeah, I'm kind of just collecting pieces. I have a very different lens. I write, I'm still kind of like cultivating my voice. So it's interesting to hear these perspectives.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, and I also am relatively new to this, and I don't think I normally put myself in places where I have quite this level of intellectual conversation, if I'm being honest. But I was raised Baptist, and I have been just like trying to, I think Catherine, you alluded to this, like the two different types of gods, the loving versus the, I can't remember what the punitive God. And
Yeah.
I have just been trying so hard to reconcile with how I was raised, and the good things that I still carry with me from that upbringing with the current state of things, and also trying to navigate my relationship with my dad, who I definitely hoped hadn't drank quite as much of the Kool-Aid as I realize he has. And I think the thing that's the scariest to me right now is that we're not all looking at a common source of facts, and that those, we talked about this, just how effective the propaganda is, and how you almost become a voice to help these people see that what they are consuming is false, and so I'm just like trying to grapple with all of these various things. I feel so helpless. I want to, like come up with some sort of I want to just like, you know fix it. I don't know. So this is fascinating. I just got your book from the library, so I'm looking forward to just diving a little bit more deeply into this, and wrapping my head around some of the research that you've done. So thank you for doing all of the work and for your perspective.
Thank you. It's really hard with relatives. I shouldn't be specific, but we have people in our family who have really, watch Fox every night and,
Oh.
um, have really fallen down that rabbit hole. And you can spend years trying to introduce new information in the most loving ways possible and still not get anywhere, which is why I
Yeah.
think the emphasis on turning out pro-democracy voters and helping people who are disengaged understand that they do have a stake in our democracy and our democratic political system, that they have a role to play. That leads to another thing the right does really well. They make sure that everybody knows, whether no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, whether you're disabled, it doesn't matter. You have a role to play, in helping to save our country
Mm,
from absolute apocalypse, which is what they say are going to be the consequences of any losses in the political arena. So I think that giving people a path to action is something that pro-democracy organizations and the sort of pro-democracy movement could do a lot better. I think a lot of people think it's fun to, go out and demonstrate, etc. But you know what? Engaging with the political process, with the sort of infrastructure of democracy in ways that aren't necessarily that fun and sometimes can be quite tedious, but are really important is really critical, you know?
I think
Yeah, I can't help but think of how they refer I just heard this recently, right? How like on the news they always start with the car crashes and the just like all of the bad news, right? Because that elicits the response and that really captures attention in a way that the good just doesn't, which is so, so sad. And I just, there's so much inflammatory stuff that it's so easy for the right to tap into that sense of anger and fear that like it just makes you wonder like how do you elicit that when what you're striving for is fairness and justice and those things just from a messaging standpoint I don't know, but it's so sad that has the effectiveness that it does.
Yeah.
I think
Thanks for that.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No, I said thank you.
I think the other thing back to the Katie, you brought up relatives and like it's not just relatives but friends. I come from a military background, and one of the things that I've learned is that um, people are going to remain conservative in their politics, and I don't know what strategy made sense that kind of thought that like you could vilify the head of the conservative party and people would stay away. Eventually they come back. Like they're not going to bail out of politics entirely. And so 2015 to 2025, which will then become 2028 and 29, if you don't have like they're not going to vote for the other party. They'll vote and not say anything about it, or eventually they'll reconcile whatever they need to in order to figure out how to make sure that their conservative political perspective is in there. And I see it all the time with my friends who've got in the different spaces who are contractors and small business owners and other areas like that. To them, it's about they're never going to vote in an area that makes their business less profitable, and that's how they reconcile that. But they weren't going to stay away, and so believing that you could go through another cycle simply without another message, then you can't vote for the head of the party is ineffective. It opens up a ton of opportunity. It can wait you out.
I mean, I do think, I truly think that Trump is one of a kind. Um, because a couple of things. So one, you were talking about community. I remember, I don't know if it was the New York Times or Wall Street Journal a few years ago, did a profile of these people who go to his rallies. And it was like the Grateful Dead, like one of them had been to like 15 rallies. Um, and it wasn't just that she loved Trump, but he inspired, she talked about how she had asked for a raise at work and got a promotion because she felt more confident, because Trump was so tough, and that made her feel tough. And if you look down ballot in the 2024 election, Democrats actually picked up a seat in the House. There's no coattails on that guy. And even in 2022, when inflation was what, 8-9%, what everyone thought was going to be a bloodbath, it wasn't, because Democrats have become the party of reliable voters, the ones who come out to every election. That didn't used to be the case even in like 2010, and I just don't, and your point about lying, right? Trump is just, he's so good at it, right? And everyone else, you see them trying to do it and they're just bad at it. Ted Cruz trying to dress up like he goes hunting, or Marco Rubio. They just look so pathetic. And even JD Vance is probably the best, and he's still not good at it. They just don't have that juice. And so it's like, if we can somehow get past this guy before it's too late, we might have a chance.
He does like keep moving the goalposts again and again and again until they're not even visible from the playing field. That's for sure. So he's a norm breaker, a rule breaker. He gave this movement rocket fuel, but the movement long preceded Trump, and it will long outlast him. So, it's not like, once Trump goes to wherever he's going to go eventually, um, will things will revert to a better way of being. I mean, he's normalizing authoritarian politics, and that's very dangerous.
I think we're past the end time, but we started late, so that's just fine. But I thought we would kind of start to get in closing. One, any other questions we'd want to ask Katherine before, and I've got one closing one. I know it's late, Catherine's time. I now know what time it is where she is. It was a little confusing. So, if you had 10 minutes with the next president, either party, what single policy safeguard would you want them to push to make a difference in the space we're talking about today?
I mean, it's hard to pick one. Can we get all this dark money out of politics? Can we defend the integrity of the courts? But I think the most toxic legacy of our time is the disinformation sphere, and it's really poisoning the minds of so many Americans. So media is a real key here. Somehow dismantling the propaganda space is really important, but I'm not sure what kind of policy solutions would work for that. At the end of my book, Money Lies in God, in the final section, I have a list of recommendations, um, and many of them have to do with, getting out of bed, getting active, building a pro-democracy movement, but some of them are structural. Um, uh, and I think that we won't be able to really take on a lot of these challenges until we get some political, significant political power back. But the propaganda, sort of disinformation spheres is frankly what keeps me up at night the most.
Yeah, it's an amazing undertaking to curate your information intake today. It's that, Katie, I saw that you put the News Not Noise Substack. I haven't seen it. I'll check it out. But like I have spent a ton of time safeguarding that input. But even then, that ends as its own version of bias too. But it's hard. Catherine, I see it all the time, and I have surrounded by
Oh
very smart people that are massively misinformed
my
about
gosh, I
lots
know.
of things.
And then AI, of course, and the sort of AI generated bots and all of this stuff is very disturbing and alarming.
Yeah, I think that's the frontier that I don't have a great answer for either. I don't even really have a thread to pull at the beginning. So it
That
is.
is from, I'm
Oh,
looking
go
at all
ahead.
the great recommendations in the chat. News, not noise. Okay.
Yeah, it's
14.
Jessica Yellen, does News Not Noise. I believe she was a White House correspondent back in the Obama years. Um, but just yeah, I found both of these letters from an American. I feel like I found them in the last 6 or 9 months, and they've just been so they list all their sources at the bottom. And I mean, the work that they put into compiling all of this to provide a perspective has helped me just with the overwhelm. The content's still overwhelming, but it's helped me a lot, especially keeping me off of, just like being all over the place and the doomsday scrolling.
Yeah, that
Contrarian.
looks good.
Awesome. Well, it was great getting a chance to meet everybody. I don't think anybody is a repeat on this one. Catherine, thanks for your time. Really enjoyed the discussion.
It's
Enjoyed
nice.
the
It's
book as
really
well.
nice to have a small group for a change. It's lovely.
I agree. It's awesome.